Hey retro community, how's everyone doing? While I was recording footage for another video, I noticed that there were some cracks in my GB Boy Color shell, which is kind of odd. Let's see it here, and here, and even here. Now, I'm not the most graceful person out there, but I don't recall dropping this. So I'm not sure where they came from. I'm hoping that they didn't come like that from a factory and that I just missed it this entire time. Way too late to return it. I mean, it still works. Still boots into the built-in list of games, as well as booting up off of a cartridge. So it works, but I'm still a little concerned. Not too much. I mean, it was like $30, and I do have an official Game Boy Color and a modded Game Boy Color among others to play games, but I figured I'd go ahead and open this up and take a look, and I realized that, I never actually opened it up when I did the initial review. So I figured I would make a video of it real quick. I also never did a comparison with the insides of a official Game Boy Color, so we'll do that now. One thing to make note of is it is a little taller and a little wider and ever so slightly thicker than the original, which in some ways could be good, especially if you have larger hands. This might be a little more uncomfortable to play with than this. But the other thing I noticed, and it was totally by accident, now the opposite isn't quite true because of the fact it's a little bit larger. I could force it, but I don't want to damage anything. But I thought that was kind of weird, so we'll open this up and compare the two and see what sort of reverse engineering these guys did to create this. And I use those in quotes because probably very little reverse engineering was done, but we'll take a look anyway. Now, whereas the original Game Boy Color and many of Nintendo's handhelds use the tri-wing, tri-blade screw, this one uses a combination of good old Phillips as well as a gambit. I believe it's a 3.8 millimeter gambit adapter. So, and that's just on the top two screws, which is weird. The other four are Phillips, but let's go ahead and get this opened. And do we have a hidden screw here? Maybe. Let's see. Nope. But we do have a ribbon here you got to be careful of, and that's because of this switch that's here. What that switch does is when you insert a game cartridge, that tells the internals to not boot into the internal ROM, but rather boot off of the game cartridge. Without anything inserted, it'll just boot to the list of, what it was, 88 games or something like that. So you gotta be very careful with that. I've gone ahead and already pre-opened the Game Boy Color, which, by the way, the only time I ever opened up a Game Boy Color was when I modded that had some battery corrosion and everything, so I've never actually seen one in pristine condition before. It's a shame that this ribbon is soldered on and not, connected with a connector, so we'll just have to deal with the shell for the time being. Get a little bit of a more zoomed in look and maybe a little bit more from overhead. So either this has more silk screening on it than the official one does, or it doesn't have as many traces. I don't know if you can see. There's a bunch of traces that are visible here, whereas here there really aren't. The other thing that I noticed is that we'll get a closer look once I get this out, the power regulator board is on the back and set up using all these electrolytic capacitors, which on the original it uses, I believe they were just solid ceramic or something similar to that. They also used through-hole electrolytics throughout most of this board here, whereas Nintendo used surface mount ones, probably for space saving and whatnot. But they do have capacitor here and here, but they don't have, well, actually one of these could be corresponding to this one, but there isn't one over here. I'm not sure what the function is for these, but other than possible power filtering. What else we've got here? So on the Game Boy Color, we've got the CGB CPU, which is, just a derivative of the original Game Boy CPU, faster, some more functionality. Got some RAM and other chips there. Whereas on the GB Boy Color, they've got their clone, KF2007 or 1820. I have to look that up and see. But some of the other components are going to be similar, maybe just updated versions. But otherwise, the layout's similar. Power switch, volume wheel, link port, cartridge connector is actually a little bit different in design than the official one. Looks like it's actually on a daughter board of sorts. That's interesting. This also does not have the IR send receiver, transmitter receiver like the Game Boy Color does, and it also does not have a ribbon, which I believe that means that the display is mounted directly to the PCB. But let's go ahead and finish taking this apart, and then we'll take a look at it further. Actually, I take that back. The display is actually mounted directly to the shell, and the ribbon cable just goes to the front, which is another thing to be careful with, so you don't just rip it out. I did notice that the placement of the screws were in similar positions to that of the official Game Boy Color, but the difference being that this screw here was a flat-headed screw, whereas the other ones have that little bit of a curvature to it. But this is going to be a little bit problematic, unless, well, first, can I remove this switch by removing the RF shield? Yeah, that should be possible. Let's get this screw out. The RF shield's a little bit different too. It's missing tabs that lead up to these holes here for extra stability, but I think because of the slightly larger shell, they didn't want to make it work. So, alright, so that should make it easier to get to. Let's see, does a speaker come out? Yeah. And the ribbon, it's a very short ribbon. I don't even know how they would have gotten in there. Unless, of course, I would have to remove these buttons and stuff too. Unless they would have to have removed or installed it first before they put the screen lens on, which is most likely what they did. Meaning this is going to be even more challenging, although maybe not. Let's see if I can get... Yeah, I should be able to lift that. Whether I can get it back in or not is going to be a different story. So, here's the other side of the board. Of course, there's some flux residue because no one ever likes to clean flux, apparently. It's another thing they stole from Nintendo because Nintendo doesn't like to clean up their flux either. Either that or it's corrosion, which would be bad, but I doubt it. I think it's just flux residue. This is the ROM chip here. In fact, this here is just a Game Boy Advance style PCB that some clone carts have used in pirate carts and things like that. In fact, I'll be right back and go ahead and take a look at this 108-in-1 cartridge, and I'll show you what I mean. It's not quite the exact same design, but you get the idea here. And this, again, this is a Game Boy Advance size PCB, but it wasn't a full Game Boy sized shell. So that's all they did, basically. They trimmed off the edge connector and just soldered everything on. Here's the ROM. I don't know. I don't think this one supported battery saves. There is this crystal here, which pretty sure the original Game Boy Color had one too. Might have had a different style. But that crystal could also be there for the ROM itself. It could be a dual purpose one. It's hard to say. Also, there's tape over here that I didn't realize. Interesting. Maybe they keep it from shorting. So, I mean, the board itself looks like it's in okay shape. I don't see any cracks in the PCB or anything like that. But I want to get a closer look at the shell. Let's see the front half of the shell. So there is a little bit of damage here near the display and the screen lens, which is not great, but it doesn't seem to be the kind that I have to worry about. Again, this is a clone console, so I'm not too, you know, choked up over it. It's weird, it looks a lot more profound when it's attached, probably because of, well, whatever. So it looks like the back half of the shell survived if it was a drop or a ding or something like that. Interesting though. Looking at the display ribbon, it is definitely smaller than that of the original. They are not hot swappable or cold swappable or swappable at all, to be honest. But let's take a look at the power board. Alright, so here's the front. Here's the front of the Game Boy Color. The power regulator board is here in the bottom left, whereas on the GB Boy, it is on the back side in the bottom right. And you can see the stark difference between the two designs. This is just a basic cheap inverter and regulator and all of that, whereas this one here is definitely got a little bit more engineering to it. But then again, this display in here probably uses different power than the one in the Game Boy Color, so it doesn't necessarily need to be as fancy. I'm not saying this is a good design or a bad design. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. The speaker on here is also similar, but not exact. And one thing I did notice that I didn't point out earlier, unfortunately, is that the speaker grill is slightly off-centered from the speaker itself, which is annoying if you know, you're the kind of person that expects perfection. But again, how much perfection can you expect from a clone system? So, but it would be off-center even with an official one. Speaking of which, I wonder, this definitely does not line up with any of the screw holes. So you cannot do a direct swap, unfortunately, if you were ever expecting that. The somewhat lines up, but not completely. So, not that I expect anyone to put it into the shell like this, but you know. So if you ever wanted to disable the built-in games, you just have to desolder this switch and that's it. And jump the connectors instead, so that it always assumes that you're putting a cartridge in. Otherwise, if you were to disconnect the switch, even if a cart was in, not sure which would override, you would probably even cause some damage. So yeah, if you did decide to disable that for whatever reason, let's say this stops working, but the console itself works, just desolder that, bridge it, you're good to go. I'm going to give this PCB a cleaning. I'm not going to do it on video. This will just be a side project for myself, as well as giving this a little bit of cleaning, because like I said, I never opened this one up. The buttons are definitely going to need to be cleaned based on the membrane, but they're not bad. It's not terrible. So yeah, so not a super exciting video, just one that I thought it was a little curious and interesting because of the fact that these cracks seemingly came out of nowhere. Again, I'm clumsy. I more than likely drop it at some point, didn't realize it. So yeah, if you guys have any thoughts or comments, do you own one of these? What do you think of it? That's that. So thanks everyone for watching. I appreciate all of you guys taking time out of your day to watch my videos. But that's it. Thanks. I'll catch you later.